Hello everyone. Welcome back to Development Economics 2. As you know, we have been discussing this topic of financial instability in a globalized world. Today's learning objective is financial globalization, international organization, and financial instability. In other words, we'll see that as financial globalization happens, what has been the role for international organization in pushing for freeing up the capital mobility, and also what has been the consequences of it, because we have been talking about the financial instability, the possibility of financial instability in a capitalist economy, and we'll particularly focus on the role of the international organization, specifically International Monetary Fund, how they have been playing a key role in kind of promoting financial globalization, and how they have ignored certain issues that are related to the issue of financial instability. So if we do a recap of what we have been doing so far, once again, just to remind you, we have been discussing the idea of globalization, its meaning, consequences, different periods of globalization, the idea of financial liberalization or money market reforms or liberalization of money market. And we have also talked about financial instability, the concept of it, various related topics around it. And also, we have briefly discussed about a select set of crises. And in the last lecture, we have also talked about the financial instability hypothesis, which kind of highlighted, left on its own, a capitalist market or the free market in capitalism leads to some sort of financial crisis without any requirement of an exogenous shock. It's inbuilt into the system. Today we are going to talk about that what has been the role of international organizations such as International Monetary Fund in promoting financial globalization, and therefore what are the possible consequences as they have overlooked certain key aspects of it. So the first segment we're going to talk about today is that we're going to discuss the push to free up global capital. Now from the very heading you can understand that as if somebody has kind of taken an initiative to kind of promote, financial globalization, or kind of free up the free mobility of the smooth mobility of capital across borders. Now, which by default then implies that the situation was not like that. Situation perhaps was more of a controlled scenario where the free mobility of capital was not there. Then, as if someone kind of pushed for it. Look at the word, the push to free up global capital. That means they had to kind of promote it, and they had to take initiatives to convince people to kind of promote this. Now, who is this? It is International Monetary Fund that we are referring to. They have played a key role in pushing for this. And of course, developed countries in this case also have played a key role in the process, therefore. Now, what appears on your screen is a detailed distinction between the classical gold standard and the Bretton Woods system. We'll go line by line here just to give you an idea, because otherwise it will be very difficult for us to follow, as later we refer to the idea of Bretton Woods system and the classical gold standard system, so that we are kind of, at the very beginning, we are kind of equipping you with the basic ideas of these two. So let's follow the first part, which is on the left side of your screen, the classical gold standard. And let's read. The gold standard was a system under which nearly all countries fixed the value of their currencies in terms of a specified amount of gold or linked their currency to that of a country which did so. Domestic currencies were freely convertible into gold at a fixed price, and there was no restriction on import or export of gold. Third, gold coins circulated as domestic currency alongside coins of other metals and notes, with the composition varying by country. As each currency was fixed in terms of gold, exchange rates between participating countries were also fixed by nature. Now let's contrast this. In contrast to this, let's look at Bretton Woods system that is on the right side of your screen. Now let's read carefully. After the chaos of the interwar period referring to the period between the two world wars, there was a desire for stability. So it's like if you have experienced some sort of instability, which they are referring to in the first line itself, that after the chaos, then you will actually want some sort of stability. So there was a desire for stability with fixed exchange rates seen as an essential for trade, but also for more flexibility than the traditional gold standard had provided. Of course, therefore, it is in contrast to the gold standard. Now, in our discussion today, we'll have one more regime of global exchange rate, which is more a flexible exchange rate as compared to the Bretton Woods system. So therefore, we are kind of giving you a brief of these two at the very beginning. The Bretton Woods system was drawn up and fixed the dollar to gold at the existing parity of 35 US dollar per ounce of gold, while all other currencies had fixed but adjustable exchange rates to the dollar. Look at the provision here. Unlike the classical gold standard, capital controls were permitted to enable the governments to stimulate their economies without suffering from financial market penalties. The last segment is kind of hinting us again to the situation of the possibility of financial instability, and Bretton Woods system kind of gave that kind of a cushioning to the governments where they could stimulate their economies without suffering from the financial market penalties. Now, let's talk about IMF's contribution since the 1980s. Remember, our topic today is actually the role of IMF in particular in kind of freeing up. And we said that we started this segment of our discussion with the idea of the push to free up capital. Now, since the late 1980s, IMF has been a strong supporter of the freeing up of capital markets. Okay. Now, there are enough evidence for that. So, countries which came under the influence or under the guidance of IMF, so let's say IMF gave a loan to a country, kind of always promoted this idea of capital liberalization. So through advice to the countries which came under its influence, they kind of promoted this idea, and it is evident from their advices to these countries that they had been trying to do this from the 1980s itself. Now, there are dismantling of cross-border lending and borrowing control, so which means there had been controls over cross-border lending and borrowing, which had been difficult for capital mobility, especially for the developing countries. Although developed countries also had that, but they also freed up their own the control over the capital mobility. But the IMF actually took it up like developing countries have to, because they had been really, really restrictive about their capital mobility in and out of their country. So they kind of took it up as like a project that they have to kind of convince people to open up the borders that way, like free mobility of capital. So to dismantle the controls over cross-border lending and borrowing for developing countries, IMF it was like an agenda for IMF. Now, of course, because the same had been done also by the advanced economies, after the dissolution of Bretton Woods system. Now, therefore, we gave you an idea of what the Bretton Woods system already was. So after that kind of the dissolution of the Bretton Woods system, developed countries also kind of open up their borders for free mobility of capital. Now, generally, there are intricate government restrictions, right? Regulations, like there could be taxes, licensing requirements, outright prohibitions of mobility of capital. This, of course, made it very limited for the capital to be mobile across borders. Most countries actually welcome this. They did welcome the multinational enterprises and long-term foreign investors. The countries generally, welcome multinational investors or long-term foreign investors, multinational corporations or long-term foreign investors. You come here, set up factories or invest here for businesses for long-term, things are fine. But short-term lending and borrowing or portfolio flows, which is also called the hot money, like it can come anytime and go out anytime. Suppose you put a money in a country where you actually set up a factory. You just can't take out the factory, right? You start the whole process and it's for a longer time. But suppose you just put the money into the share market or in the other kind of financial instruments in a country, you can just decide the next moment that I'll withdraw from that country. So let's say right now, if you decide to invest in a country, in the portfolio investment, right? Not like the investing to set up some big business or something, like portfolio investment, if you just decide, maybe in half an hour or 5 minutes later down the line, you got a phone call from a friend who says, okay, that market is not doing good. Why did you invest there? In 5 minutes, you can actually take out that money, right? Let's say. So I'm just saying for example to understand. Maybe there's some time gap also that you need. But it's for a very short term, right? Like within few days, you can actually withdraw the money 15 days, 20 days, unlike 15 years, 20 years. So countries generally prefer, they welcome multinational corporations or foreign investors to set up, businesses there to invest for long term, but they're not very, very much comfortable with short-term lending and borrowing or portfolio flows. That is called the hot money. And they were viewed very differently as a source of financial instability rather than economic growth. Now, if that was the perspective, and this is something IMF had to change. Now, IMF took a couple of routes. It took the route of influencing these countries through their, adjustment loans and process everything. They give loan, they have certain conditions about that. And the other thing is kind of, there's a soft power play that is also going on. They're trying to promote this idea. Now, IMF officials will talk about these issues in IMF annual meetings, and some of that we'll refer to in the discussion today. Also, big economists, they will actually talk about that, look, this is a good idea, the country should do this. Now, if the governments actually listen to economists, and they might follow some of these economic suggestions from the economists, so they will also be influenced by that. So that was, a few routes that IMF can take. So the official stand was this, that effectively IMF, first of all, IMF did not have any legal authority over capital flows. Countries were free to do whatever they wanted to in that regard. So, but capital movements, they kind of promoted this idea that capital movements would increase investment, growth, and prosperity. Investment, growth, and prosperity by enabling global savings to flow to their best possible, productive avenues. So it's like if there is some enough saving in a developed country, and in a developing country, a new prospective, future is emerging, that the fund can actually flow to that country, invest, park it there, that will finance the investment in developing countries. It's a good thing, right? That fund was lying idle in some other country, did not find enough use for it. It could easily move to countries where it could find the use for it. Now, that's how the idea is very appealing, actually, right? Now, of course, the government would therefore also need to kind of proceed in an orderly manner. This is a very important thing. You can't be reckless. Yes, there could be issues, but you have to go in an orderly manner. And policies at the national level or international level would need to ensure that things would go as per planned. So, what is the right path forward as per the official stand by IMF? The right path forward is the liberalization of capital flows. This is an essential element of an efficient international monetary system in the age of globalization. Because we are in a globalized world, capital market liberalization is the way forward. Because we discussed, it helps investment, other prosperity, and so on. And here they're talking about efficiency in the international monetary system. Now, we refer to the other idea that economists are also promoting this idea, right? Because there has to be an intellectual basis for a policy. When you are kind of promoting a policy, there has to be an intellectual backing for that. So economists, the big economists also had to, many of big economists actually came in support of this idea. For example, Stanley Fischer, IMF economist since 1994, he made an intellectual case for freeing up, capital. So why the capital should be, there should be capital mobility of capital across borders. Although he did acknowledge that there are risks involved in the whole process, but he said that does not mean the countries would oppose this idea of liberalization of capital market. They must kind of go for liberalization of capital accounts, so that, through the international trade account, the capital account has to be liberalized so that money can go in and out. The hot money also can go in and out, without any, delay or process, getting stuck in some red tape process, everything, without much inhibitions, without much, hindrances, much restrictions. There should not be these things. Free mobility of capital. There are risks, but that does not mean you do not do this. Now, this is a very interesting case. Rudy Dornbusch, look at the year. In 1996, he wrote an article. It's time for a financial transactions tax. This is an article that is very much cited, often cited about for the reason that why we should control financial capital market mobility and all that, financial liberalization. So this article is actually talking about taxing financial transactions, which actually is in a way kind of talking about controlling this international capital flow. So why there should be roadblocks, why there should be roadblocks on cross-border financial flows, why those things are needed, right? This is what he is writing in 1996, 2 years down the line, 1998. The same person would actually declare that Capital controls is an idea whose time is past, which means it is not relevant anymore. It is a thing of the past. We should now move towards capital mobility. Now he wrote, the correct, and we quote, the correct answer to the question of capital mobility is that it ought to be unrestricted. In 2 years down the line, he just completely reversed his position about the capital account mobility, the capital account liberalization. IMF strongly promoted the free mobility of capital, and we are now referring to an IMF meeting. It has annual meetings. We are now referring to a meeting that was happening in 1997 in Hong Kong, where they're actually talking about why we should open up, why should we liberalize the capital account, why should we should have free mobility of capital across borders. And here is the funny side. They are having this meeting in 1997 Hong Kong amidst an ongoing East Asian crisis, financial crisis, right? That started in the East Asian countries and which then spread to other countries like Russia, Argentina. So consider this. There is a conference happening in Hong Kong in late 90s that why should we open up, a capital account? Right? Why should we have free mobility of capital? Sitting right in the middle of a financial crisis that is going on in Asia, which started in Asia, right, and then spread to other parts of the country. It may sound very weird, but that is the fact. Now, clearly, the IMF actually, by the way, so it's not like IMF did not say that there's no crisis. IMF said the reasons for crisis, the government is corrupted, they did not take right policies and etc. But there are also counter arguments to it, that suddenly the fundamentals of the country, all these countries went wrong. They had been doing so well so far, right? Suddenly things went wrong for countries like Indonesia and all this. Things were so good so far. What happened all of a sudden? But they did not really, IMF said, no, the problems with the government, the policies are, there are a lot of corruption, the policies are not good, etc. But, scholars would also counter this and argue that clearly the crisis, indicated that there is something endemic to financial market itself. It was not like suddenly these countries had been doing good and suddenly every fundamental went wrong, right? So it's not egregious sins committed by the Asian governments. There was something inbuilt in the financial market itself which kind of led to this crisis. So let's just quickly refer to the key issue here. It's like we talked about the run on the bank in a previous lecture, right? It's like the countries were like the banks. People are taking out money from these countries. It's like you go and take out your money from the bank. So people who have parked money into these countries, suddenly there's a panic, they just started withdrawing the money from these countries. So there's a run on the bank. In this case, the countries are like the banks. So, and look at these prominent countries, Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea. And it's like there's a public fear on bank run, which will lead to a bank run. Okay, just let's take a minute to understand this. So as if there is a possibility of bank run, which creates a panic, and there's a bank run. But then in modern economies, there are powerful tools. But when it comes to, so there is central banks who act as a lender of last resort. So at the national level, there are controls, there are measurements to counter this. But then in case of international market, international finance, there is no international lender of the last resort, and there is no international authority to guarantee the short-term debt. Now, IMF continued to kind of promote this idea that why you should have capital account mobility, and United States played a key role here. Now, let's pause for a minute here and say what are the supposed benefits of free international mobility of capital. And as we said in the discussion so far, there's a prospect for good investment, good economic growth, and the savings could find a better, more efficient allocation of funds in this case. Because if you have free mobility of capital from a country, it can go to other countries where there is productive use possible. Now, let's talk about the Bretton Woods consensus on capital controls. In the heydays of capital control, where like capital control was the talk of the town, everybody believed in capital control. It was the post-World War II. Economists, it is now, which was like a respectable doctrine at that time. In academic and banking circles, like both in academia and in banking circle, that there's this agreement that there is a substantial measure of direct control over private capital movements. They all agreed. Economists said it should be, bankers also agreed perhaps, especially of the so-called hot money varieties. And that is desirable for most countries, not only in the good years, or not only in the immediate years after the World War, also in the long run. So it happened after the World War II, this consensus came up, And the idea is it's not for a short-term period, it's like a permanent thing that we should have a capital control and see how things actually changes after 1970s. The Bretton Woods arrangements actually, kind of completely in alignment with this idea. Keynes argued that the agreement gave every government the explicit right to control all capital movements on a permanent basis, not a short-term thing. There was almost complete convergence of views among economists and policymakers of that day that we need capital controls. Moreover, capital controls were not viewed as simply a temporary expedient. It's not like it will be removed once the market is stabilized. It's a more of, it should be the new normal kind of thing. So it should be the more long-term thing, right? So there is a history to it. The reason is, as we mentioned at the very outset, that there was a chaos between the interwar period because of the previous regime. So there was a desire for, capital control and stability at the global market. And a gold standard which kind of existed before that, that created a lot of instability. Now, the fundamental problem with the opening up of the capital market, according to Keynes, was this. Keynes said that why there should not be unfettered capital flows? Because it undermined not only financial stability but also macroeconomic equilibrium, like issues of full employment, price stability. The idea that macroeconomy would self-adjust without help from the domestic and fiscal monetary policies had been buried in the experience of Great Depression, because Great Depression had showed us why do you need government intervention, why you can't leave everything to the free market. Now, even during the periods of relative calm, like things are fine, the combination of fixed exchange rate with capital mobility that could enslave a country's economic management to other countries' monetary policy. Suppose some other country is maintaining a high interest rate, you just can't, lower down your interest rate, because then there will be a massive outflow of capital. And you can't do the reverse. You can just say, okay, I'll keep the interest rate at higher than some other countries, because then you have suddenly a lot of inflow of capital. So it creates some sort of instability here, right? Now, what about not sticking to a fixed exchange rate as the Bretton Woods suggests? Why not make it floating exchange rate, flexible exchange rate, something that started in post-1970s? The alternative of that is this, right? Alternative of the fixed exchange rate is a flexible exchange rate. Now, countries which actually opted for floating currencies, they let their exchange rates move in response to private capital flows, while domestic monetary policy remained autonomous. This can be done, right? Now, this theory eventually became the reality, as we said, but Keynes and other contemporary economists kind of opposed this idea for two main reasons. A, they worried about the financial instability. They will create an excessive volatility of currency driven by successive bouts of euphoria and pessimism. Suddenly there could be a lot of happiness, expectation, good expectations about the future. Suddenly everything can be very pessimistic. This might create excessive volatility. And they were also concerned about the currency instability and uncertainty on international trade. So which kind of creates a paradoxical situation that if you have to kind of reduce the transaction cost for international trade, you have to increase the transaction cost for international mobility of capital, which is like you have to make, this has to be some controls over capital mobility, especially of the hot money kind of, right? Now, what is the problem of unfettered capital flows as we discussed? Of course, it will lead to some sort of instability, and not just the financial instability, it could also harm the macro stability. Now, the primary philosophy of the Bretton Woods system was that, there was a policy space that was given to the government, that even within the fixed regime, you had the options of you can play around it. In addition to capital controls, there are two other features. There was a provision of short-term financing from the IMF to help the countries with a temporary, so kind of there's a bad time, you can take short-term financing from the IMF. And even though countries were expected to maintain their currency at fixed parities, right? But there was a kind of, in case of when you are deviating from the equilibrium fundamental, you're getting into a fundamental disequilibrium situation, you had the policy space to kind of play around with your flexible, with the exchange rate. So therefore, it's a fixed but adjustable exchange rate. And that is what we are writing here. Now, in case of international money, the problem is that sustaining a global economy requires a global medium of transaction and store of value, which is a money that is made available in ample quantities whenever that is needed. Gold played that role in the gold standard. In the case of the Bretton Woods, US dollar played that role actually. Now, even though all other countries could in principle devalue their currencies, the system relied on the United States would never devalue their currency. Now, the Bretton Woods regime then therefore became dependent on what is known as the dollar exchange standard. So there was a lot of trust and importance of on the US dollar here, as you can see. But then the question arises, what if United States itself gets into a trouble? And that is exactly what happens. In 1971, confronted with growing demands from foreign countries to convert their dollar holdings to gold, President Richard Nixon and his Treasury Secretary John Connolly, they faced a choice. The choice is this. In one hand, you either tighten the domestic economic policies or you suspend this whole idea of the convertibility of dollars to gold at a fixed exchange rate. Of course, to safeguard their own domestic economy, they chose the second one. End of Bretton Woods system, right? Now, with there was a 10% surcharge on imports. Now, this decision happened in 1971. Now, that sealed the fate for a global regime of fixed exchange rate. But now it's no more like fixed. The Bretton Woods system kind of comes to a collapse, therefore. Now, there's a small kind of quiz for you. What was the exchange rate between US dollar and gold under the Bretton Woods system? You can just go and check. We'll not give an answer because it's something like a quiz. You can go to the previous slides and you can check the answer. Now, with the dissolution of Bretton Woods system, the problems are like this. As world trade and finance expanded, the policy space that the existing controls afforded, that also reduced, and external constraint began to play a larger role. That led to the problems that Bretton Woods system actually faced. Now, we talked about this, that there was so much trust over USA and all that. The belief system that supported capital controls began to dissolve over 1970s. Right? And it was subsequently replaced by the fact that you can make it more flexible. You should make it more flexible. And therefore, it's like capital account, it becomes like inevitable thing that the capital account needs to be more free, right? It has to be liberalized. Now, just in case of trade, now see, this is the time that things are changing. Just in case of trade, an agenda of deep integration centered on the free capital mobility would replace the Bretton Woods system. So there was a capital mobility control in the Bretton Woods system. Post 1970s, that situation changes. Now it's a new world where should be flexible exchange rate regime, and of course the capital should be liberalized. There should not be control over capital movement, right? Now the national economic interest also played a key role. Countries like United States and England, right? Britain, they were major financial centers, and if the capital markets of various countries are liberalized, they would benefit from it. Now you have to understand, it has been now 30 years or 26 to 30 years that the Second World War is over. That, bad memories of the two interwar periods, they're fading away. So as that fades away, the financial interests begin to carry even greater weight in shaping the economic policy. Like in 1940s, you would refer to look what happened, but 1970s, things are of the past, then situation also there are problems right now. So there's a possibility for new ideas. Now, what if the financial market actually misbehave? And that is exactly what we are going to talk about. The IMF kind of pushed for the capital market liberalization. Things did not go as per planned. There was capital market liberalization, but that also led to serious crisis. What is the dominant narrative? The dominant narrative, as we mentioned earlier also, is that the liberalization of capital movement was both inevitable, it is not avoidable, and it is desirable because it will benefit. Now, second thing is the market determined exchange rate were a double blessing. Why? Because they would prevent currency misalignments, where allowing countries to conduct their monetary policy independently. If a government wanted to kind of have a contractionary monetary policy, they can expansionary monetary policy, they can also do that. It kind of allows. All you have to do is accept the fact that your exchange rate is going up or down. It's a flexible exchange rate regime. But the question is, are financial markets truly efficient? Now, these theories were based on implausible assumptions about how speculators and investors behaved, how rational and forward-looking they were, and how much their activities contributed to economic growth. There are a lot of what some authors are arguing, there are a lot of implausible assumptions that are made here. Moreover, there's a new consensus that showed little appreciation for the differences between domestic and international finance. In case of domestic arrangement, you have a central bank. But who takes that role of an international regulator here? You don't have that provision either in the theory or in reality of an international regulator, and that creates a lot of issue in the international market, right? Now there is, by 1980s, you actually then start experiencing excessive volatility and misalignment. There are a lot of problems, like currency values fluctuated too much on day-to-day basis, and there were prolonged periods of currency under or over valuation. Now that created difficulties at the national level also. So the financial instability that we are talking about, once the capital market is freed, it made little difference with whether currencies were pegged or allowed to float. Like Tobin argued, I will quote, the debate on the exchange rate regime evades and obscures the essential problem. The fundamental problem is the excessive mobility of private financial capital. National economies and national governments are not capable of adjusting to massive movements of funds across the foreign exchanges without real hardships and without significant sacrifice of the objectives of national economic policy with respect to employment output and inflation. So clearly, capital mobility is creating problem for national level stability. So we have financial instability and crisis. There were quite a few financial crises here. And first, there was Latin America debt crisis in 1980s. Then you had Europe in 1990s. Then you had mid-1990s saw the Mexican crisis in Mexico, which is called tequila crisis. And also, then there was East Asian crisis. And then, apparently, there were many other crises between 1970 and 2008. So the pattern is simple. Now we are coming towards the end of our discussion. The pattern is this. Most of these cases follow the same boom and bust pattern. A, there is a phase when there is a relative euphoria during which a country receives significant amount of foreign lending. Good time, lot of money coming in. The stage is fueled by stories and financial markets that everything is good, there's a good prospect ahead. Then the country has reformed its policies, everything is good. But suddenly there's a bad news. The borrowers then can be government, private banks, or corporate entities. In the end, it doesn't matter. Because suppose there's a simple bad news, it will create a panic. Either at domestic level or external, sets off what is known as the sudden stop. So, we are coming to the conclusion here. First, the world economy has achieved unprecedented levels of growth after the World War II, during the Bretton Woods System. Second, that growth is kind of unparalleled compared to the years previous to it and the years after it. And third, the growth champions of the last 3 decades, just as those of the immediate post-war decades, were countries such as China, which actually played the globalization game by Bretton Woods rulers. So within the era of globalization, China is one of those countries who really benefited a lot, but did not go by the dominant rules of the time. It actually continued with the kind of Bretton Woods structure. So the kind of financial capital mobility, financial liberalization that was promoted seems to have not benefited a lot most of the countries in terms of the crisis, stability, etc. But a country like China benefited a lot, which kind of followed the Bretton Woods system, something that is discarded. So in conclusion, the inevitable conclusion is that the financial globalization has failed us. This is the argument that some of the critics are making. Countries that have opened themselves up to international capital markets have faced greater risks without compensating benefits in the form of higher economic growth. Thank you.